Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for having me here today. I'm very honored to be here and to have this opportunity to share some of my work with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about reproductive efficiencies and specifically getting the most out of your gilts. So when you think of reproductive efficiency, it does have major effects on the economic profitability in the swine industry. Reproductive efficiency is often measured by the number of pigs weaned per sow per year. And if we look at PigChamp benchmarking from Canada in 2020, we can see that there's an average about 25.8 and a range of about 22 to 28.9. So as we can see, there's a large variation and there is room that we can make some improvements. One of the challenges or limitations of using pigs weaned per sow per year is it doesn't take into effect the longevity or retention of that gilt within the herd or that female within the herd. So another way we can measure this is through annualized pigs weaned per sow herd life days. There are three other factors that affect the sow reproductive efficiency, and that being longevity and retention, so the number of parities at removal or sow herd life days, prolificacy, the herd life piglets born, and fertility, the herd life non-productive days. And this is measured by weaning to mating intervals and reservice intervals. These four factors together give us an estimate of lifetime performance and ultimately affect the efficiency of our sow herds. So there are limiting factors for sow reproductive efficiencies. Again, looking at the topics or the ones we just talked about, longevity and retention. And the greatest source of variation is the early removal of young sows from the herd. The data would say that 10% of gilts that are served never farrow a litter, 15 to 20% of sows only produce 1 litter, and 40 to 50% of sows are called prior to third parity. When we look at prolificacy, again, data would say about 40 to 50% of gilts selected as replacement gilts are called prior or due to reproductive failure. And when we look at fertility, about 70% of non-productive days are due to reservice and culling intervals. So I think this really strengthens our argument in that it is really crucial to identify animals with the greatest reproductive potential prior to entering the breeding herd. So this brings us to gilt management. I think gilt management is one of the critical drivers of sow lifetime productivity and efficiency of our herds. We know that gilts are the foundation of good production, and we know that gilts drive from success now and in the future. However, we also know that gilt management is sometimes often looked on the farms. Farms are still lacking good gilt replacement programs. And we also acknowledge and appreciate there are a lot of challenges in implementing these good gilt management programs. And I hope I am able to emphasize in this talk is that there are several key aspects to gilt development. It's not just a single factor contributing to the success of your gilt development unit. This slide shows the stages of a good gilt replacement program. And what I really want to emphasize is a gilt becomes a replacement female at birth. Of course, within any gilt development unit or in your farm in general, there are several other factors that affect gilt development, such as your genetics, your health programs, nutrition and ventilation, people and biosecurity. And all these factors need to be addressed by the professionals within your system and the people that you work with. But aside from that, we feel that there are 4 stages to a good gilt replacement program. The first one being called pre-select 1. And this occurs about between birth and weaning. Gilts need to have good conformation, adequate number of teats, good health, good growth. And what I'll talk about briefly in this presentation is birth weights and birth weight phenotypes, which really ties into what Dr. Jessica spoke about yesterday. Pre-select 2 occurs about 140 days of age. Gilts must meet these minimum requirements again in order to be selected and to move forward in the gilt program. The final selection stage, where we'll spend quite a bit of time today, is really the response to the gilt to puberty stimulation through direct boar contact. We'd like to see this happen between about 170 to 200 days of age. And overall, a goal is to have 85% of gilt of estrus within 35 days and an additional 5–6% of females that we'll call non-select. The final group, or the final stage, is breed group management. And again, ultimately our goal is to have your breed targets consistently met with select gilts with known improved cell lifetime productivity at target weights, at second to third estrus, and we have to make sure our feed management prior to breeding is met. So this sounds like a tall order, but I'm going to give you some ideas of how to achieve this. So in this slide, we talk about the 10 key principles of gilt placement management. Although I'm not going to go through them on this slide, through the remainder of the presentation, I'll go through each one of these key points individually and tell you how it relates back to those stages of good gilt production and give you some actions of how to deal with this. So key point number 1 is a low individual birth weight. On this graph, on the horizontal axis, we have 6 different sows, and each point within the sow represents a weight of an individual pig within the litter. So on paper, these sows are exactly the same. They have an average total bone of 14 and an average litter birth weight of 1.4 kilograms. However, in reality, these litters are very different, both in the variation around the mean and the number of pigs within that litter that fall below 1 kilogram. So those pigs could be classified as low birth weight, and those low birth weight pigs are a major concern for our industry. When we look at gilts with a low birth weight have compromised survival and growth, and they negatively influence piglet production and longevity. Dr. Billy Flowers has even suggested that those gilts below a minimum birth weight of 1.1 kilograms simply do not have the reproductive machinery to be efficient reproductively, no matter how they're managed later in life. And one action you can do here is to really consider, if you're selecting gilts, some of these gilts need to meet the minimum requirement, about 1 kilogram, in order to be selected females in your herd. So this is in comparison to the sow birth weight phenotype, as shown here. So on the right-hand side of this graph, we have 6 more sows. Each point within the sow represents the weight of an individual pig within the litter. These litters are an average total bone of 14, so similar to the table I initially described. But as you can see, the litters are very different. We can classify these litters as having the low litter birth weight phenotype. And as you can see here, the average litter birth weight is about 0.9 kilograms. And we can classify these ones as having the high litter birth weight phenotype, as shown here. So their average litter birth weight is about 1.9 kilograms. The challenge is these litters with the low birth weight phenotype have entire litters of low birth weight pigs. And this really becomes a challenge because, as Dr. Jessica talked about yesterday, these litters, all these pigs within these litters will have been subjected to intrauterine growth retardation, and they will have poor pre-weaning mortality. So these sows with the low birth weight phenotype, the gilts born to them really carry all the same risks for individual low birth weight gilts, but it's a litter trait. These sows with a low birth weight phenotype account for about 10 to 15% of your herd, and they're going to produce litters with the greatest risks of pre-weaning mortality. And these low birth weight pigs, although they're only 10 to 15% of the herd, disproportionately produce more of the small birth weight pigs across the entire herd. Unfortunately, this litter is a repeatable trait. So once a gilt has it, she'll likely have it in her parodies, but it's also a real opportunity that we're able to better manage this. If you're on a nucleus multiplication herd, these sows with the repeatable low birth weight phenotype really do decrease the efficiency of your genetic transfer program, decrease the number of select gilts produced per sow bred, and increase the number of low birth weight pigs born. So Sorry, this is covering here. Get that out of the way. So the next third key principle is early response to boar stimulation is the critical selection tool with any gilt development unit. This data is from Dr. Jeff Valet. What he did is he started about 1,200 females puberty stimulation at 160 days of age. And he either heat checked them till they came into heat or for an additional 100 days of age. As you can see, this is the resulting distribution. As we all see within our barns, there's these later responding older gilts that we could classify as those hard head gilts that just seem to be really slow into coming into heat. And this is not surprising because we know if you keep checking gilts long enough, they'll eventually stand. We do expect to see about 95% of gilts will eventually cycle in 100 days. But this really does have some negative consequences. So as shown here, Dr. Valet has classified this larger distribution into 3 minor distributions and classified them as early, mid, and late responders. And it's these late responders that Dr. Valet would suggest have poor cell lifetime productivity. And our data would agree with that. We would call the gilts that come into heat by about 200 days of age, 10 days of age as select females, and those late responding gilts, those hard head gilts as non-select females. And I'm going to show you in the next few slides why these non-select females have poor cell lifetime productivity. And what I really want you to think about, as you select more and more of these non-select females into your herd, you're entering actually more sows with poor cell lifetime productivity. So I think it goes back to determining what your selection criteria are, because I know in several farms, you'd like to see that you breed 95, 97% of the gilts out into your herd, but have you think about whether this is a good target to have. So this slide shows that select gilts are better than non-select females. There's a lot of good data out there. So we know that estrus characteristics of puberty are predictive of future performance. Gilts with stronger estrus symptoms, so the length and the strength of the standing estrus are more likely to farrow. And stronger vulval signs of puberty are related to stronger vulval signs of first weaning. So if you have a gilt in your herd that just won't stand very well and you're really struggling to get in there into heat, that might be a good enough non-selection criteria because she's going to be that sow that you struggle with that first farrowing. We know that an early pubertal response is linked to better cell lifetime productivity. We also know that gilts with early puberty are seminated earlier and have fewer non-productive days. Gilts with increased age at first mating are more likely to become low efficiency sows. And this is really due to the increased calling intervals related to reproductive failures. And we also know that gilts bred less than 230 days of age produce more pigs alive, and this is linked to better retention in the breeding herd. So one of the actions that we can take for this key principle is to really accept that an efficient gilt development system is a key component of your gilt development unit. So key principle number 4 is that direct contact with boars is more efficient than fence line contact. We know that the boar effect is the most potent stimulus for pubertal onsetting gilts. It's a combination of tactile, visual, auditory, and olfactory cues. So within your unit, both your gilt development unit and your sow herd, all your boars need to be looking like this guy right here. He's chomping and foaming, and you can see all the foam right here. And this is really important because this is where the salivary pheromones are, and it transfers from the boar to the gilt. And this is why you need nose-to-nose contact for the stimulation of puberty. Boar libido is also a critical factor, influencing puberty, attainment, and gilt. Sometimes I go onto the farms, and you can see the boars that are used there are often the most docile boars, the quietest boars, but not necessarily the best boars used for puberty stimulation. I don't know how to see if that helps. Good. The next point is daily direct exposure to a rotation of boars really maximizes the response to the component of the boar effect. And this is essential. Oh, sorry, I'm having troubles here now. And we also know that direct contact with boars is the most efficient in triggering puberty compared to fence line contact. Dr. Knox would say that about 20% more gilts are in heat within the first 20 days or the first 2 weeks compared to fence line contact. And this really allows direct contact, really allows the gilts the freedom to solicit the boars. And this behavioral aspect is really important in our gilt development units. I'm really sorry here. So the action here is to design efficient systems that maximize exposure to the boar effect. And we would advocate really for the use of a bear system. It really takes into account all these key factors that we're just talking about, but I also appreciate this when possible on both farms. So whatever puberty stimulation program you design on your farms, make sure it includes all these factors. So point number 5 is a recorded pubertal estrus by 200 days of age is a critical benchmark. What this does, it allows gilts to be bred at second estrus and at acceptable target weights. So when we look at estrus of breeding, our target is to breed gilts at least second estrus. So I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Juan Carlos Pinilla from a PIC, and we analyzed a large data set from Quequén in Mexico. We had 30,000 gilt records of the PIC line 1050 female. What we did is look at the effect on estrus at service on first litter size and retention rates. So we can see that gilts bred at first estrus, as shown here, had lower fairing rates, total born and born alive at first parity compared to those sows bred at second or third heat. So see here, it's about a 5% improvement in fairing rate and about 0.4 of a pig in litter size. And this effect also just wasn't seen at first litter. It was carried through to retention of third parity, as shown here. Those gilts with a lower bred at first heat had a lower retention rates, and they also had fewer pigs born than those pigs that are bred at second or third heat. So really, I really want to emphasize the need to implement a good gilt management system so you can identify first estrus and make sure gilts are bred at second heat. And often when we do go into farms, it's often saying, well, those gilts are old enough, they should have cycled. I don't think this is something that we can assume has happened, because more often than not, when we go onto farms, we actually measure this. Gilts are actually still being bred at first estrus. So the second key component of this is weight at breeding. We want to see gilts bred between 135 and 160 kilograms. And this is really because in the commercially available gilts that we have, their growth rates are very high. So growth performance really dictates that gilts need to be in heat by 200 days of age. And I think this graph nicely illustrates the reason why. So here on the horizontal axis, we have weight at service, weight at 190 days of age, And you can see the range is from about 120 kilograms to about 170 kilograms. If we're to look at our target weights, we want the target to be 135 to 160 kilograms. At 190 days of age, most gilts are below that target and some of them are still light. But as I just mentioned, we want gilts to be bred at second estrus. So we can even see when gilts are going to be expected to be about 210, 215 days of age, most gilts are still below our target weights. However, as you can see, it's those gilts, those non-select gilts, those late responding gilts, that are going to be overweight if they're bred at second estrus. We also have to make sure that we realize if you don't start puberty stimulation to 200, 200 days of age, it's going to be really, really hard to get any of your gilts bred at second estrus and acceptable target weights. So the action here is, again, I'm sounding like a broken record, I know, during this talk, but we really have to implement an efficient gilt management program early enough to make sure gilts are bred at second estrus and at acceptable target weights. Point number 6 is that heavy weights at breeding are a risk factor for retention in the breeding herd. So as we can see here on the horizontal axis, we have weight at service and retention to through parity. So as we can see, as you increase in weight, you also decrease in retention. I didn't talk about it due to time, but it's the loss of the young parity sows after first weaning that really drives retention rate. So what, again, we need to do is control weight at breeding by limiting the entry to breeding intervals. Point number 7, or key principle number 7, is an established sheep no serve program permits effective pre-weaning management. I think what's important to take away from this slide is that any feed or any event that disrupts normal feed intake has an immediate effect on LH secretion. And what this does, it removes the critical priming effect on follicular development. So this will have negative effects on your fall colonocyte quality and gilt fertility. What is important to take away, we really have to watch those risk situations for reduced feed intake in our gilt and the gilt development. This may include relocating gilts within 16 days prior to breeding, remixing gilts prior to boar stimulation. This will have a negative effect on your response rate. Crowding that limits feed intake, health problems, water not flowing, so gilts aren't eating well enough, and fighting and grouping. So what's important here is to make sure prior to breeding, gilts are acclimated to stalls or gestation housing 16 days prior to breeding. This slide shows some of the key components for gilt eligibility that we're just talking about. We talked about age at puberty, weight at breeding, gilts to be bred between 135 to 160 kilograms, all gilts bred at second estrus, and again, feed management is really important. What I want you to remember about this, each of these are equally important. So if you think of 4 tires on a well-functioning car, each of these tires is needed for the best functioning of this car. We also have to focus on what our finish line is. We don't want to just look at performance at first litter. We have to remember our ultimate goal is improved efficiency in our sow herd and cell lifetime productivity. Point number 8 is that first litter size is predictive of later lifetime performance. I can almost guarantee if we were to look at any one of your production records, we would get these same results. So if we were to classify gilts based on litter size at first pairing, as shown here, in this case, it's 4 different categories, so less than 7 all the way up to 15 or more pigs at first pairing. This is predictive of future performance. So those gilts that have low litter size at first pairing are going to have low litter size through the productive life. So as Dr. Juan Carlos would say, good gilts are consistently good sows. And this is really why a good gilt management program is so essential. So again, sounding like the broken record again, one of the actions is to really make sure you have a good gilt replacement strategy in place to be able to maximize your performance. Point number 9, or key principle number 9, I know is one of the most challenging ones, but trained staff and adequate numbers of trained labor is really important. We had the pleasure of working with a lot of great teams, and I think this says really well. We really need to change the culture in our farms, allocate the staff and management needed to do good gilt development, because I think it will pay off. So the action again is make sure you have good labor and good trained labor. It's one of the most important units in your farm. Number 10 is records and analysis. And again, this was talked about yesterday, the old saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. But I really think there's some key points. We really have to make sure we record data accurately. Like, this is literally one of the most important factors that makes your data usable and makes us be able to help you better. We use this data that's collected to provide insight to track reproductive success, and it allows us to enable data-driven decision-making. And often in our gilt development units, the data that we need is often lacking. So this is just an example, some of heat check records in which we know when gilts come to heat, their weights, and so we can really use this data to help. So again, the goal is to make sure we collect the data, record the right data, and analyze to see how we're doing. So in conclusion, I think it's really important that we have to start with the end in mind. Our goal is to improve sow lifetime productivity and the efficiency of gilt replacement management. We have to accept that good replacement management from birth is a critical driver of sow lifetime productivity. And we have to implement a system that really identifies these 10 key principles. One of my last slides here is to make sure that we really identify that gilt development isn't low-hanging fruit. And Dr. Foxcroft would say this over and over. But the definition of low-hanging fruit, if we look here, it certainly isn't easy and it's not obvious and it's not readily done, but it is certainly necessary in achieving success and making progress towards our objectives. So we can't go through any presentation without acknowledging a lot of the people that we work with. As I was mentioned, I work at Livestock Gentech at the University of Alberta. I personally work with several great partners that not only support our work, but we work together to improve their gilt management. And also very thankful to our funders over the last several years that really allow us to do good research and answer some of those questions that help make us better producers. And of course, some of the companies that support Livestock Gentech is shown here. And just finally, give you a picture of the faces at Livestock Gentech at the University of Alberta. They really do a lot of work in Alberta for livestock genetics and genomics research. And we're hoping to do more knowledge translation to help you as producers. So with that, I will close and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's been wonderful to look at that. You can look at the Q&A. We have a couple of questions there for you. And if we can address some of those questions, would be great.
Okay. So why do second parity gilts drop off in litter in number born alive? I think this is a good question to ask because I don't think all second parity gilts drop off in litter size. I think often when we do the work up front, make sure gilts go in at the right weight. The service weight is actually to meet a target bearing weight to let gilts go through lactation the best they can. So our hope is that with the good gilt management system, we're not going to have that second parity dip that we often see in parity 1 females. The reason why it is, it's usually due to a higher negative energy balance during first lactation. And this is what we want to avoid by making sure those gilts are proper weight entering the bearing house. So next question. Would the bigger gilt selected from a litter that has a large variation in birth weight also show the same birth weight variation in their lone litters? Some of the data that we've seen is that the sow birth weight phenotype is a repeatable trait, and it's also a transgenerational trait. So yes, I think you might be expected to see some of those litters, those gilts having the same characteristics of the litters that they were born to. It is recommended to rebreed a gilt that did not catch. At what point doesn't it make sense to rebreed? I think this is another really key point because any data that you look at, the success rate of gilts or any female being bred at the second estrus is poorer than the first estrus. I think ideally you'd give the female one rechance, one rebreed, and if she fails to that one, not to rebreed her again. So if we receive gilts in our quarantine that are heavy versus their age, can we limit feed them without affecting performance so that they will not be too heavy when they reach their second heat? I think the question is, it is a good one. So I think, and I'm assuming that gilts are in heat, and it's between first and second estrus. And in that question, we don't definitely want to restrict them just to those negative effects that we saw in feed. The target is really to allow ad libitum feed intake, or at least feed to appetite during that first and second estrus to really have the best effect on your litter size at breeding. So I'd be careful about limiting them between that first and second estrus.